This analysis of Jak II will take an in-depth look at the game's design. Jak II is a mishmash of gaming genres which is tricky to classify. When it first released in 2003, the combination of open world, platforming, third-person shooting, driving, and skateboarding was unprecedented, and a massive shift away from the tighter platforming focus of the precursor legacy. Jak II is so far removed from the first game that it's hard to judge them against one another at all. They're both commonly said to be platformers, but they're on the furthest opposite ends of that spectrum. As a result, there are big changes to how the game plays, but what I find most interesting about this is that Jak's core moveset remains unchanged. Naughty Dog took the same basic movement mechanics and built an almost unrecognizable game around them. As a result, it's easy to see the basic similarities between the games, but the way the game design frames them couldn't be more different. The game's tutorial is an odd inversion of the one in the first game, which introduced its unique concepts in the tutorial without telling the player how to control the game. Jak II introduces no concepts of its own, and instead has big old button prompts to teach new players and remind old ones. Jak controls exactly the same as he did in the previous game, same double jumps, roll jumps, spin kicks, and awkward punches. I don't really have a problem with button prompts. The game never completely stops movement to explain anything, which is an improvement over the first game, and the basic skills the player will need are efficiently, if inelegantly, taught in the space of 2 minutes.
Do you remember how to jump?
For the first few missions, you could be forgiven for thinking that the differences between Jak 1 and 2 have been greatly exaggerated. After the tutorial, the player is tasked with a handful of linear platforming missions, using only the movement and melee combat mechanics copied verbatim from the first game. The one new addition would be Dark Jak, a powered up mode where Jak can only use melee attacks but does significantly more damage. To be honest, I'm the kind of person who saves this kind of power up for that opportune moment which never arrives, so I end up not using Dark Jak much. If anything though, it serves to illustrate just how uncommon it is for the game to throw several enemies at you in melee range. Dark Jak is useless in ranged combat, but melee enemies tend to come a few at a time, not in large packs. There's only a handful of instances where Dark Jak is useful for the entire time it lasts, making using it too often feel like a waste. Dark Eco also highlights a small issue I thought was worth mentioning sooner rather than later. Dark Eco particles have pickup magnetism, but Metalhead skull gems have to be walked directly over. It's inconsistent. With the Dark Eco as such a conspicuous point of comparison, every time you pick up a skull gem it feels like an inconvenience. Another issue worth bringing up early on is the Y-axis camera control. In all 3 Jak games, up and down on the right stick don't adjust pitch, they adjust zoom. Moving the stick will zoom in and out on Jak instead of pivoting the camera to see above or below, as it is in almost every third-person action game with camera control. This is just stupid. Being able to look up and down gives the player a better view of the environment. If a ledge is low enough to jump to but too high to see, how is the player to know it's there without the ability to look up? One level late in the game has this exact problem. I can't be ready to shoot these enemies if I can't see the ledge above. And what benefits does a zoom have? You can have a closer look at Jak's character model, I guess? That's a nice looking floor texture. I gave Jak 1 a pass for this because it was early days for twin stick camera control and it never presented any actual significant issues. By 2003 though, very few games were still getting this wrong, and there had been plenty of opportunities for Naughty Dog to learn from the successes of others. I have no idea how difficult it would have been to change the camera's programming, but it's an effort that should have been made. For these first few levels, it seems that the game has simply compressed the first game's sprawling levels into singular paths, and linked them with a larger, more over-designed open world. Jak II follows an open-world mission-based structure inspired by the contemporary smash hit success of Grand Theft Auto 3. That's not speculation, this actually was one of Naughty Dog's primary inspirations. In the Naughty Dog 30th anniversary documentary, the studio is very open about how heavily they were inspired by the most popular games of the time. The open world came from GTA, the hoverboard came from Tony Hawk, the guns came from any number of the shooters that were beginning to steal market share from mascot platformers. There's one key difference between the open worlds of Jak II and GTA 3 though. In Jak II, there's nothing to do in it. GTA 3's mission structure was set up to take advantage of the game's open world. Most missions took place within the free-roaming environment and attempted to combine the game's various mechanics. Jak II fundamentally misinterprets this. The open world only exists as a connecting element between linear levels. Typically, the game will cycle through driving to point A to be given a mission and driving to point B to leave the open world and play the linear level. Very few missions actually use the open world for anything at all, and when these do happen, they only ever involve driving somewhere and/or shooting something. The game never combines the open world and game mechanics in a way that justifies having an open world. And I think it's important to establish exactly what Jak II's core mechanics are. Obviously, Jak's core moveset, copied from Jak I, is the most basic form of frequent mechanical interaction. Once Jak gets a gun, it almost replaces melee combat entirely, so it's fair to say the gunplay is a core mechanic too. You'll do about as much driving as walking, particularly while travelling to the next mission, so that's another one, and you'll use the hoverboard in the actual missions about as often as the driving, so that can probably count too. So that's 4 sets of core mechanics, only one of which can interact with any of the others. You can shoot on foot or while driving. To go back to the open world, there are some interesting dynamics here. Hovercars have varying levels of health and speed depending on size. The smallest are the fastest, but one good crash will take them out, while the largest are the slowest but can take plenty of punishment. The hovercars can fly in 2 zones, at ground level or about 10 meters off the ground with all the AI traffic. The player only has to avoid other vehicles at traffic height, but has to avoid crimson guards at ground level. Hitting one of the guards will set off a GTA-style alert, and every guard in the city will try to shoot you down, which might be why every crimson guard in the area is marked on the minimap. Of course, it's extremely aggravating to try to avoid traffic around blind corners, and easy to outrun an alert, so there's a clear path of least resistance here, but I'm pointing out that there are some dynamics here that could have fed into open world mission design. Perhaps a driving mission on a time limit where the player has to avoid an alert. Either they have to put up with the traffic or take their time to drive around the guards, neither of which lets the player get complacent with the timer ticking down. The problem is that the game never does anything with these dynamics because most missions take place in the sectioned off levels. The open world becomes a particularly inefficient mission select menu. The first time you have to travel through the city, the dynamics of the open world might present an interesting, if not particularly challenging task. The 15th time you have to do it though, it's not going to be so interesting anymore. I spent about a third of my 10-hour playtime here driving to the next mission, so if you've finished Jak II in the past, you've spent about 3 hours of your life travelling back and forth across an open world that's functionally empty. Imagine you're playing Super Mario Bros., but there's a twist. Every time you finish a level, you have to play level 1-1 again. Now, 1-1 is a great level. If you know anything at all about level design, it's probably that 1-1's first 5 seconds are absolute genius. But imagine having to play it after every single level. 1-2, back to 1-1, 1-3, back to 1-1. Which level do you think you'd be sick of after a couple hours? Which level would make you wish for a level select screen? Because that's exactly what's happening between missions in Jak II. The driving itself meets par but isn't anything beyond that. Though the turning radius doesn't lend itself particularly well to the sharp 90-degree turns of Haven City, the only times the game actively tests the player on their driving ability in 3 races, this issue is remedied with smoother, rounder turns. Considering how much time every single player will spend driving, it's damning that I can't make more than 2 sentences of it. You can shoot while driving, but this is only used in a couple of missions and is very situational. Shooting in Jak II comes in 4 forms: a shotgun, a blaster rifle, a minigun, and a sort of long-range grenade launcher. You get the last one very late, and ammo for it is scarce, so for the sake of argument I'm only going to take a look at the first 3, the ones every player will be most familiar with by the game's end. The gunplay is perhaps the most often criticised aspect of Jak II's gameplay, as it relies heavily on character-relative auto-aim. I spent a lot of time paying close attention to the gunplay during this playthrough, and I came to the conclusion that the auto-aim is actually very good at compensating for the lack of camera-relative aiming controls. The question then becomes, if the game does a good job compensating for the gunplay's shortcomings and facilitates gun combat quite well, then why do people still take issue with the way it feels? To answer that, we need a lesson in geometry. But first, to clarify some terminology, camera relative aiming control is when the gun is always aimed in the direction the camera is facing. The player can be moving backwards, but the gun will stay pointing forwards. Think the way a typical third-person shooter controls, from Max Payne to Uncharted, or a Ratchet and Clank game while holding the strafe button. Character relative aiming control is when the gun is aimed in the direction the character is facing, regardless of camera position. If the character is moving left relative to the camera, the gun will be aimed left relative to the camera, which is forwards relative to the character. Think the way the first Ratchet and Clank controlled, with its lack of strafing. This is what Jak II uses. In a sentence, character relative aiming uses 360-degree rotation, which feels inaccurate because bullets travel in straight lines. So let's break that down. With character relative aim, aiming is circular. The character can spin around in a circle and aim in any direction. The problem with this is just angular geometry. For the sake of simplicity, let's say the tip of Jak's blaster rifle is 1 meter away from him, and his maximum range is 4 meters. If I point Jak north and then turn him 90 degrees, then let's say the tip of his blaster rifle travels 1 meter. This is where the problem arises. The space between aimed shots increases the further away the bullet travels from the center point, divergence. At our maximum range, the space between these points is not 1 meter but 4. If I then fire a shot in between these 2 points while turning, if it's 1 centimeter to the left at minimum range, it's 4 centimeters to the left at maximum range. In practice, this means that every tiny movement from Jak's center point makes the aiming laser pointer shift wildly downrange. This is why it can feel like you're constantly under or overshooting your targets when aiming from a distance. You can only just tap Jak a few centimeters, and at the edge of the circle the aim has shifted by an order of magnitude more. This is also why the shotgun works so well, with a large spread and short range. If we assume the spread is 90 degrees, then the shot continues to widen until it disappears. It takes up this entire quarter of Jak's surroundings instead of just one infinitely small point on a circle. It's also why the wild spray of the minigun works a little better than the blaster. If I spray 10 shots between the 2 points, they're still going to diverge outwards, but with more bullets, there's more chance of hitting something regardless. Camera relative aiming has none of these issues because it deals in straight lines. Applying a basic strafing system to the diagram, we can see that shots don't diverge. Fire a shot, then shift only a centimeter to the left and fire another, and the 2 shots will still be a centimeter apart at maximum range. Of course, this design has its own limitations. Enemies which spawn behind the player can become unfair, and levels need to be structured with a lot of sharp angles since aiming is best suited to straight lines. But there's no denying that this method of control gives more control. Tying movement and aiming to the same input simply can't measure up.
I see your point.
And as a result of that, Jak also has no way to aim along the y-axis. Aiming up and down is handled entirely by the auto-aim, so you better hope that that enemy shooting at you from above is within the game's invisible range. As such, the auto-aim never feels quite right either. Once you're used to the aiming, it can feel strange to see Jak rotate his torso to track a target here when you know you'd be aiming here were there no enemy. In this spot in a later level, I can just stand in one place and Jak will track targets along both the X and Y axes without any input from me. I just have to keep shooting. There's never the sense that you've lined up a shot just right. The game does it for you because it would often be completely impossible. Still, as I said before, the auto-aim does do a good job at compensating. It leads to gunplay that's less about the aiming and more about the shooting. It's basic, and it attempts to complement the other mechanics rather than supersede them. I have no idea if Naughty Dog wanted it that way, but if that was the intention, I'd say they overcorrected. With the manual aim feeling so inaccurate and the game doing all the compensating, there's no sense of satisfaction because the controls aren't good enough to create it and the automation takes it away. If the shooting isn't satisfying in a vacuum, then it's the integration with the platforming and melee combat where it begins to show some merits. The character relative aiming approach is at least more consistent with the platforming mechanics. If you've played one of the more recent Ratchet & Clank games, you'll understand that there's a clear separation between how Ratchet controls when platforming and how he controls when shooting. The most recent ones even turn on strafing automatically. Ratchet is character relative when platforming and camera relative when shooting. While this allows greater control over the shooting, there's no denying that there's a clear separation between when you're platforming and when you're shooting, marked by a shift in camera controls. If nothing else, Jak II is at least more consistent. The camera controls and perspective stay character relative at all times. This prioritizes the platforming controls at the expense of aiming. It allows the developers to build levels in which platforming, melee, and simplistic gunplay can take place simultaneously, because there's no disconnect between the mechanics. There has been at least some consideration given to this, primarily with melee. Melee attacks and gunfire can be chained together in some brief and uncomplicated combos. For example, firing the shotgun, punching an enemy, and then firing again cancels the cocking animation. Jak doesn't need to chamber another round, and if you pull this off fast enough, Jak can fire faster than usual. Doing the same with the blaster will have Jak fire off 3 shots in quick succession, much faster than the standard fire rate. In the case of the minigun, this skips the wind-up time and takes the fire rate to maximum immediately. Interestingly, if Jak hits nothing, he'll just fire at regular speed, so these combos suggest some thought behind how the melee combat and gunplay could interact. It's simplistic, but elegant. Of course, those who've played the game will know which combo is most useful, though I'm not sure I'd call it a combo at all. Doing a spin kick in the air and firing the blaster will send 5 shots out in random directions, but if an enemy is nearby, then at least one of the shots will hit them. This is so useful because it combines an evasive maneuver, jumping, with an attack, and because the auto-aim is so incredibly generous, it's easier and faster than lining up a shot. In the time it takes you to turn to aim in the general direction of an attacking enemy, you could have jumped over the attack and shot downwards at an impossible angle to retaliate and not had to aim at all. Of course, the trade-off is the wasted ammo. Of the 5 shots, Jak isn't likely to land more than 3. This move feels superior because the shots come fast and the aim is so accurate, despite Jak spinning around like an idiot, but the actual hits landed will balance out to about the same as firing normally. It's the evasiveness of the jump that turns this into a truly dominant strategy, because it's the only way to land hits on enemies and still evade yourself. With the character relative aiming, if you're running west to avoid shots coming from the north, then you're no longer aiming at your target. With the spin shot, you can run west, jump evasively, and still have a chance to land a shot blindly on an enemy which might not even be on screen. Health is so scarce and ammo so common that the wasted ammo isn't enough to prevent this from becoming a dominant strategy. Again, the standard auto-aim is pretty good, but because of the way character relative aiming feels, it's easy to just constantly use the move that doesn't need you to aim at all. It results in gun combat that looks like this more often than it looks like this. A move that is simple to execute, minimizes damage taken, and maximizes damage dealt is the very definition of imbalanced. A move that renders all other moves significantly less useful. The easiest solution I can think of is to make this move more strenuous. If the fire rate stayed the same but the trigger had to be pulled for every shot, the timing would be significantly stricter to get all 5 shots out before Jak lands. And the extra complexity would both put some people off and make the others have to work for it. And balance seems like a good segue into difficulty. Jak II is a legendarily difficult game. Regardless of personal experience, it's a fact that this game has been called hard from the original 2003 reviews to the ones for the 2012 HD remaster. Personally, as someone who's played a lot of games and enjoys a good challenge, I find it refreshing that Naughty Dog were willing to make a mascot platformer so crushingly difficult. You could certainly argue that the difficulty of a game series should stay somewhat consistent, especially one with an art design that appeals to children. However, with the market in the late 90s dominated by that sort of game, I liked seeing this art direction contrasted against this extreme difficulty. For me, the biggest deciding factors on difficulty are fairness and mechanical consistency. If a game is extremely difficult, but it's always possible to avoid an undesirable outcome, then the game has a right to demand the player improve or progress no further, because it's being honest about the skill level it requires. If a game is extremely difficult because it's impossible to avoid an undesired result, the player has a right to become frustrated at the game design rather than at their own skill. However, a game should also present its difficulty using its core mechanics. If Jak II were to, say, ask the player to complete an unprecedented and extremely difficult Simon Says minigame to progress, then it lacks mechanical consistency. This minigame is technically fair, but has nothing to do with the base mechanics. It uses the buttons of a PlayStation controller, but in completely different ways for a completely different purpose. The base gameplay builds up button associations. This button jumps, this button kicks. The Simon Says game is arbitrary. The buttons that lead to the desired outcome are effectively random and change every few seconds. If I were playing a Simon Says video game, this would be expected and could fit into the difficulty curve somewhere. But in Jak II, it exists on an entirely different flow chart because it only shows up once. It's like if I taught a 10-year-old how to ride a bike, then booked him a defensive driving course. They both involve motor skills, he'll be fine, right? Anyway, judging the game on its own merits, are Jak II's core mechanics always fair? Well, on the surface, yes. Enemy melee attacks are avoidable by keeping your distance, all ranged attacks appear to be avoidable projectiles, and the game gives a few hits leeway so a run through a level doesn't have to be totally flawless. But it's those projectiles that present a few problems. Initially, they do indeed seem to be projectiles, but they're deceptive. Some of them are actually well-disguised hit scan. Crimson guards will fire at Jak when they have him in range, and their first few shots will miss. Somewhere between their third and fifth shot, they'll land an unavoidable hit. How many missed shots seems to depend on distance. The goal is to land a hit on the attacking enemy before he lands one on you, sending him into a hit stun animation and cancelling his attack. This becomes most problematic in the infamous mission where Jak is attacked by dozens of guards at once. With so many guards shooting, it's not always possible to line up shots against all of them. The auto-aim can track the wrong target, the spin kick can choose the wrong targets, or you can just plain overshoot because of the aiming controls. This is where Jak II rides a very fine line between fair and unfair. Within the game's combat systems, it is technically possible to hit stun all the guards individually, but it's not always possible to put those systems into practice efficiently because of the aiming controls. The flaily aiming is suited for shooting multiple random targets quickly, not for lining up specific targets deliberately. I think this is where I can make a judgment. Jak II's combat systems are fair, but because of the controls, some arrangements of those systems are not. Of course, unfairness comes in many forms. In this one mission, there's no way to know that the game will instant kill you for jumping into the water until you've done it. Since the water is otherwise completely safe, this is the game breaking its own rules to prevent the player from swimming past all the enemies. Without rethinking this mission entirely, frequent checkpointing can help alleviate frustration with this kind of trial and error design. It's still not acceptable that the game killed the player in the first place, but at least they're back to where they were quickly, now armed with the new knowledge gained from dying. This is the element of Jak II's difficulty that's most often called into question. the checkpointing system. Dying seconds before finishing a mission will often send you right back to the start with no checkpoints whatsoever. When people call Jak II hard, this tends to be what they're referring to. Now, on the surface, I don't have an issue with this either. If a developer wants to base their challenge around demanding the player get through an entire level without dying, I think they have a right to do that if their game is fair. Repeating stuff over and over can of course become tedious, but perhaps you could argue that if you're dying that often, the game is expecting a higher skill threshold. The checkpointing becomes an issue if the player feels the game has been unfair. If I were to jump into the water for the first time during this mission right at the end, and the game spawned me perhaps one wave of enemies before, I'd still think that's unacceptable, but the punishment is so small that I quickly move on. Since the game actually spawns me back at the beginning though, I become hugely frustrated. I've been punished significantly for something I couldn't have predicted. And now I'm being asked to make a significant time investment to do it all over again. This is the problem with infrequent checkpointing. You need to be sure your game is supremely fair. If something unfair kills the player, the more you ask them to replay, the more frustrated they're going to be, and the less likely they are to put up with it and keep playing your game. To be fair, Jak II is pretty good about this. The underwater turret is the only blatant example of unfairness that springs to mind, but the other problem with the checkpointing is when it starts to feel like padding to mask the short length of the missions. Jak II is a long game. There are 57 missions, give or take, but the missions themselves can be as short as 5 minutes. If the player spends 5 minutes driving to a mission start point and then the mission is 5 minutes long, there's not going to be a satisfying amount of gameplay before you're back to that overly interactive mission select. The difficulty can both make missions seem longer than they are and also highlight just how surprisingly short they actually are. More than once, I died when I thought I was halfway through the mission, only to later find that I'd actually died right at the end. It makes me wonder which came first, the level design or the severely punishing checkpoints. Either Naughty Dog chose to limit checkpoints in place of longer levels, or they set out with the express intention of making an extremely punishing game while keeping character designs aimed at children. I'm not sure which of those is more misguided, but I know I'd have liked the game's length to have come from longer levels, more actual content, rather than punishing checkpointing and open world travel time. There's really no ideal time to bring up the hoverboard because it doesn't really feed into the game design or the other game mechanics with any sort of flow. I'd argue that it fits into the game's mechanical consistency since it is in line with the ideals of a platformer. The jump button still jumps at least, but it does feel very removed from the rest of the gameplay. The key difference between this and the Simon Says minigame is that the hoverboard mechanic is used at least a dozen times and has its own difficulty curve. The first time it's introduced, the player is required to learn how to chain grinds together, which is the skill that the game will most often demand. It essentially becomes a way to force the player to move at a specific speed. There are some obstacle courses designed around it, which are made difficult because the hoverboard moves forward automatically. On foot, these would be either impossible or extremely easy but incredibly slow. It's definitely the most arbitrary of the core mechanics though. None of the other mechanics interact with the hoverboard, and while it does have a difficulty curve, it again sort of exists on a different piece of graph paper. Among the general discussion of mechanics, I've struggled to say anything about specific instances of level design. With 57 missions instead of 9 levels, there's a lot of area reuse in Jak II. The game relies more on constantly reframing its mechanics than reinterpreting them through level design. The hoverboarding levels are the best at this because they get rethought constantly. One level is an open park where you chase down metalheads. Another is an obstacle course which requires some platforming and grinding skill. A third is the only mission to use the open world in a unique way, hovering above the lake to destroy some dead drops. And one more has you grinding along wires to detach some cables in a circular layered cavern. Sometimes these have focused level design like the obstacle course, but some are open enough to allow freeform movement like the metalhead chase. There's a clear focus on constantly rethinking the mechanic and then designing the levels to match. In the case of levels which focus on shooting and platforming, some levels are used more than once and sprawl out in a few different directions, but with only one goal at any given time, they are functionally linear. If Jak 1's levels could be condensed into linear paths, then Jak 2's levels are those linear paths. Nowhere is this demonstrated better than by the approach to the Baron's Palace. This is probably the first level in any of Naughty Dog's games chronologically that remains visually impressive even today, with 13 years of hindsight, and it's also linear enough to be a Crash Bandicoot level. Of course, I have nothing against linear levels. I think the more linear a level is, the more easily a designer can consider every possibility, because there's only one angle of approach for the player. It's restricted, but also easily foreseeable. The problem arose when I looked back and realised that Jak 2 only ever escalates its level design in the simplest ways possible. More enemies, more pits, more shooting. After about the halfway point, there aren't any new enemies which have to be fought in different ways, only more enemies trying to kill you simultaneously. There aren't any new arrangements of level gimmicks which are more demanding to platform around, there are just more holes. The game does its best to frame this differently each time. One might be an escort mission, one might be swinging through a tomb, but they all come down to jumping and shooting. I hesitate to reduce any game like that, but Jak 2 reduces itself. The focus is still squarely on the mechanics, but unlike the hoverboard, the levels are an excuse to use those mechanics again, never a way to rethink them. It's like Naughty Dog copied the mission structure from GTA 3, which was often an excuse to get the player to do yet more driving and shooting, but applied it to the linear levels as well as the open world. This sort of samey mediocrity is hard to pinpoint with nothing to measure it against, so let's take a late game example where the game very fleetingly gets the level design and the mechanics to harmonise. While running from this giant centipede metalhead, the player has to shoot these platforms to flip them over before they can land on them, or Jak will slide off. Why couldn't there have been more of these? They already combine gunplay and platforming and could have easily fed those mechanics into the level design too. How about a scenario where the player has to manage their footing on a few of these while also shooting at distant enemies? What if the enemies jumped on themselves and you could shoot their platforms to flip them off? It's concerning how similar this is to something I said in the Jak 1 video, and just as I said then, all these elements are already here. I'm not suggesting these platforms function in any way they don't already. But no, better put in some more bottomless pits and groups of reused enemies instead. All this is to say, it's very difficult to judge the merits of Jak 2's level design because it doesn't complement the mechanics or put them to use in imaginative ways, but it doesn't get in their way either. The level design exists simply because mechanics can't present challenge without a space to use them in. That's just how games work, so that's just how Jak 2 works. It's not demonstrably bad, but it's intensely predictable. It doesn't do anything wrong, but that's because it doesn't do anything interesting. Of course, no thorough analysis of Jak 2 would be complete without some mention of the change in tone. It's no secret that the change from a light-hearted mascot platformer to a grim dystopian setting was brought on by the quote-unquote mature direction games were beginning to take in the early 2000s. The change itself doesn't really bother me, as I'm more interested in the mechanical differences between the two games. But I have to acknowledge how inconsistent it can be. One minute Jak can be angrily accosting an old man for information.
You look like a reasonably smart man. I want information. Where the hell am I?
And the next, Daxter can be saying something like this.
This place has too much excitement. We need to move back to the country.
And just to clarify, I didn't add that sound effect. It's actually in the game. It strikes me as a bit futile to try to market a game featuring this character to a mature audience. Maybe that's why his name isn't in the title this time, but he's still on the cover. Naughty Dog never fully commit to the new tone. I have to admit, if you choose to look at it all as a sarcastic reflection on mature gaming, it's quite entertaining. but there's nothing in the story or dialogue to suggest that this was intentional. Probably just a happy accident when someone tried to write a brooding script while still including Max Casella.
Stop that! This is serious, you moron.
The story itself is one of those time travel plots that's confusing to summarize but easy to understand in context. Essentially, Jak and Daxter are transported to what appears to be an alternate reality, but they soon discover it's their own future. Jak meets his younger self. It's revealed that he grew up in this future with a younger Samos. At the end of the game, Jak sends young Jak back to the past to grow up. Along the way, there's an evil Baron and a hive of metalheads providing the conflict. If Jak 1 was Naughty Dog's first attempt at writing an entertaining character with Daxter,
I'm Daxter. Who's Jak?
then Jak 2 is their first attempt at writing an engaging plot. All their previous games had simplistic framing devices to contextualize the player's actions. There's a bad guy who's going to destroy the world, or your friend needs help, so do this arbitrarily important thing to progress. I call these framing devices because they frame the gameplay but do very little beyond that. It's obvious that they exist as pieces of context for the player's actions, not as high literature. With that said, well-written characters can still coexist with a simple framing device. Jak 2's plot has a little more going on. The Baron and the metalheads are necessary elements to frame conflict, and the plot could have been left at that, but the time travel and young Jak add a few more twists and turns, and are additional elements which don't feed into gameplay. As such, I'm not going to pass judgment. As I said, I'm far more interested in mechanics, so I only begin to consider narrative beyond the framing when it's been given equal or greater attention than the gameplay or begins to interfere with it. Since this is a series on Naughty Dog, we'll be getting to that point eventually, so it seemed relevant to point out that there's been a little more effort put in this time. And at worst, it's harmless. When I began writing this script, the first draft was a bunch of disconnected ideas on completely separate topics. I needed to get some core thoughts down and worry about how they would fit together later. This is how Jak 2 feels to me, a bunch of ideas thrown at a wall to see what sticks. With platforming, driving and hoverboarding all being so disconnected from one another, a lack of control over the gunplay, the one mechanic which can interact with the others, an open world which is disregarded the moment it's introduced, and level design which is unwilling to fail so it doesn't even try, there's a sense that, unlike the final version of the script, nothing in Jak 2 flows into anything else. It has an open world like GTA 3, but it barely uses it. It has a skateboard like Tony Hawk, but it's far less fleshed out. It has gunplay like Ratchet & Clank, but with none of the development hindsight that made Ratchet & Clank 2 play so much better only 1 month later. And it has platforming like Jak 1, but with none of the expert level design that kept me talking about that game for half an hour. However, GTA 3 doesn't have platforming, Tony Hawk doesn't have guns, Ratchet & Clank doesn't have an open world, and Jak 1 doesn't have a skateboard. Jak 2 was unique for being an aimless hodgepodge of mechanics. I know I'd prefer to play 4 games which do 1 or 2 things well, but I guess doing 4 or 5 things passably is its own sort of backwards achievement. I just wish Jak 2 did something well. This video ended up pretty long, it kind of ran away on me, so if you've made it to the end, thank you for watching. I don't really have any other videos to recommend on the subject of Jak 2. I've never really seen any aspect of the game analysed like this before. If you know of one, I'd love to give it a watch. Instead, I'll point you in the direction of that Naughty Dog documentary I mentioned a couple times. It's enlightening. If you didn't go back and watch it, my Jak 1 video can be found here. Thanks again.